Good morning and welcome to the Crawford Family Forum. For our last installment of the Drucker Business Forum this season, we're excited to have Bridget Schulte as our guest. Bridget is the author of Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. I am the father of a 2.5-year-old, and to say that this book hits home with me is a true understatement. It also hits work, it also hits play, but like a lot of people in your book, I'm still working at the play part. So I want to talk a little bit more about Bridget Schulte. She is an award-winning journalist for the Washington Post, for the Washington Post magazine too. I have won an award or two in my day, but I have not won a Pulitzer Prize. She's part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize. She's also a fellow at the New America Foundation, and just as importantly, she's a spouse. She's a mom of 2 kids, teenagers, and she lives with her husband and those kids in Alexandria, Virginia. Thanks so much, Bridget, for writing this book and for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And I guess I would say the spouse and mother part is more important than the Washington Post and New America stuff, even though that is also important. But
I didn't want to make any assumptions. So we've got this incredible book, Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. There is a lot of academic research in it, just an incredible scope there. But it's also your own personal journey to find some balance in your work life, in your home life. So I have to ask you what anyone would want to know is, why did you decide to write this book?
Oh, man. Well, this book, I have to say, would never have happened if I had not made sort of a fateful phone call one day. At the Washington Post, we were looking at our readership numbers. This was several years ago before we went digital, so this shows you how long that this book has been percolating in my life. And we were looking and noticing that there was a big drop-off in women readers. There was a big gap between male and female readers that they couldn't really understand and they hadn't seen before, they being the people, I suppose, in power who tend to be men. And so they put together what they called the Women Readers Committee, and I got appointed to this committee, and we walked in, and there were all women sitting around the table, and our task was to figure out why women weren't reading the newspaper, and we looked at each other, we just rolled our eyes. It's like, well, duh, women are busy, you know? I just thought about even in my own morning, my husband would be sitting there sort of in this protective bubble reading the newspaper calmly, and I was emptying the dishwasher, and I was loading it, and I was making lunches, and finding the crumpled up homework, and signing the Girl Scout forms, and oh, you forgot your soccer gear or whatever, and running after kids on the way to the school bus. And so my morning was nuts. And so we just thought we all had very heavy caregiving responsibilities outside of work. We were either caring for kids or aging parents. Some people were guardians of nieces and nephews. And it was like we were trying to live 2 lives at once and feeling really stressed about it in a way that others that we were competing with in this very demanding work environment were not. And so we just said, women are busy. That's why we wrote for the newspaper and had a hard time reading it in the morning. Mornings are very fraught for a lot of women. And so wanting to have the data, being journalists, investigative reporters, somebody said, yeah, aren't there time studies? And I had never heard of this field of study before, and now I am very familiar with time studies. I've read a lot of them since then. And so I raised my hand and said, well, I'll find out. Not knowing anything, I Googled busy mother, women, time, and found a time use researcher, called him up and said, we're doing this report on why women aren't reading the paper. We figured they're too busy. And he said, wrong. Women aren't busy. Women have 30 hours of leisure a week.
I remember reading that in your book and going, wow, it's like this guy is almost trying to put someone in their place.
Well, you know, I really felt like I felt 2 things. I was furious, like, oh man, one more thing to feel bad about, really? Where are those 30 hours? I just felt like he was living on a different planet. And the other thing is I was also terrified, because what if he was right? And there was something wrong with me, that I was sort of like living on the sidelines of my life. It just felt like it was screaming past me. And there was a sort of a fear and sadness with that, because I know it's my one and only life. I know that it doesn't last very long, and yet I didn't seem to feel that I could do anything about it. I felt very stuck. Yeah. And most of the national conversation was, well, you chose to be a working mother. This is just what you have to put up with. So I kind of thought that I did. And so I said to this time use researcher, you're out of your mind. I don't have 30 hours of leisure. I feel like my hair's on fire most of the days. And he said, yes, you do. Come and do a time study with me. I will show you where your leisure is. So he laid down this challenge, and that's honestly how this whole book came about, is I did a time study. He found 27 hours of what he called leisure, and I called scraps of time confetti garbage.
Yep.
And so I wanted to figure out, well, what is leisure, and why do I not have it? And I wrote a magazine piece for the Washington Post magazine just about that time study. And I remember telling my editor at the time, I was terrified to write this. I said, I will be honest to the point of not getting fired, because I was so terrified that I was going to expose myself as disorganized or neurotic or crazy or something, that there was something wrong with me because I thought everybody else had it figured out. And after I wrote the piece, we left for the weekend. It's like, I don't want to be here. I was, and if you read the online comments, like most anonymous online comments, they are, oh, you're disorganized, you're neurotic, you're crazy, get your act together. But when I started getting emails from people, and I got so many, I ended up printing them out. It was a stack, honest to God, this high. And 201, they said, you climbed into my head and you wrote about my life. Wow. And at that point, I thought, okay, what's going on? What makes this particular time period so overwhelming? Is it different from other time periods? It wasn't just women; it was men and women writing me. It was
that
young.
was my next question.
Yeah, it was young people who hadn't started families. It was older people who didn't know how to enjoy retirement. It was people with children. It was people without children. And so that's when I thought, okay, I will use myself as a flawed narrator, because I'm very flawed. You can, in one way, I say I wrote this book so that people can learn from my mistakes, and I'm still a work in progress. I've moved a long way from chapter 1, but I'm still a work in progress.
Well, chapter 3 is called "Too Busy to Live." Too busy to live. That could have been the title of the book, but it really made me wonder what makes us so busy, why we're so determined to be so busy, and if we know any better.
Yeah, well, that was one of the questions that I had as well. And the time use researcher that I spoke with, he said, oh, people feel busy, but it's all in their heads. And so it's like, that was one of the questions I wanted to look at. Well, is that true? Is it all in our heads? And so, again, I wanted to take my skills as a reporter. I've been a reporter for over 25 years. I wanted to take all of those skills and really look at modern life in the same way, with the same kind of skepticism and yet open-minded, looking for data and research. So I looked in the kind of archive, if you will, of people who do work and life academic research, and I found one person who studies busyness and the fast pace of life. And I looked, and her name is Ann Burnett, and she's at North Dakota State University. And I called her up. I'm like, Fargo, North Dakota? You study busyness in Fargo? And she just said, oh, honey, you want to meet some overwhelmed North Dakotans? I can arrange that.
Well, what really struck me, everything struck me, especially the first half of that book. I took a note on every page. But what I remember about Fargo was you talking about a woman who was asked, when's the last time you actually had a chance to breathe, to just take a break and breathe? And she said, when I was at the doctor's office waiting for my mammogram. And that hit a chord with me because, my dentist thinks I'm the nicest man in the world. Because I go into the dentist office and I know it's somewhere where the cell phone reception is bad. I know that I'm not going to get any emails in there. And I know that I'm just going to lay there with my mouth open and not have to do absolutely nothing. And everyone in there is really nice. So that's actually a place during a regular work day where I get to take a break every 6 months, because I have pretty good teeth, and just have someone and so that's why I'm really nice to them, and I imagine that's why they think I'm nice.
Well, that struck me as well. And on the one hand, I'm really glad that you can relax at the dentist, but on the other hand, why is it that so many of us feel that way? Why do we feel like to have leisure time, it has to be productive, or that has to have some element of self-improvement about it. And that's what I really discovered, is that in the United States, a century ago, we showed our status by how much leisure time we had. There were people wrote about the idle leisure class. And it's in 100 years, it's completely flipped, that even the wealthiest, think about how we talk to each other. We really show our status today by how busy we are, by how much we can cram into a day. So I went out to Fargo, North Dakota, and she put together a focus group that I could observe. And what struck me is, not only sitting in the doctor's office for a mammogram, that was the only place that she felt that she had leisure, but that all of them felt that they didn't deserve leisure, that there was something about it wasn't productive, that it was a sign of weakness. And so that they felt like they had to just always be busy. And there is one thing, there is a very strong element of work, the work ethic, Protestant work ethic. Americans work hard. That's always been part of our national character. But really, since the 1980s, it's become a culture of overwork. And you see that in the work hours that particularly among white-collar workers have been on the rise since the 1980s. And we now work among the most hours and among the most extreme hours of any advanced economy in the world, save Japan, where they have a word for death from overworked called karoshi. They have a word for all what they call cloaked overtime, which I'm sure you all know that you're supposed to only work a certain number of hours, but you don't. You stay because the boss expects you to, or because, we reward people who stay late at the office. We think those are the best workers. They call it furoshiki, cloaked overtime. And in South Korea, they're so overworked that they have now opened prisons, meditation prisons, where overworked people can go to check themselves in, to just get away from work.
Wow.
So we're not quite that bad, but we're on that path. So it's a really interesting...
America, not quite that bad.
Yeah, that's right. But getting there. And so I think that was one of the most interesting things to me, is I actually had to confront my own feeling of embarrassment about writing a book about leisure. At the New America Foundation, which is a fantastic think tank, nonpartisan, really smart, fantastic people there, and I'd go to these meetings and people would be talking about their research on war and national security and economic policy, and they'd say, "And what are you researching?" Leisure. And I remember chasing one of the board members to the elevator. It's like, really, I promise there's scholarship here. There are people who study this. I felt really stupid because we tend to think that leisure is silly and unimportant. And that was one of the most revelatory things to me, is finding out how important leisure is, the play part of the book, that in leisure is where civilization has been created. It's when you are done with the kind of survival aspect of your life that you have time to daydream and imagine a different future, to let your mind wander. That's when the wheel was invented. Art, philosophy, literature, that's sort of the time out of time that really kind of takes our human experience to the next level. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher in the 1930s, in his essay In Praise of Idleness, said that without leisure time, mankind would never have emerged from barbarism. So it was a real lesson to me to figure out how to embrace that leisure, because in the United States, there's a lot of guilt associated with it, that it's a waste of time, and it really isn't. And there's great neuroscience now that's showing how you really need that in order to be creative and innovative.
Now, you went in search of workplaces, really throughout the world, that foster leisure or a more complete person. The way you write about the country of Denmark makes me think that just about any company operating in Denmark would be a great place to work. But here in the United States, for example, talk a little bit about places where you actually saw some hope that one could be rewarded for not being quite as driven into the ground of the job.
Right. Well, and that was the thing. When you look at the social science, we do work these long hours in the white-collar world. And again, since the 70s and 80s, for lower-income, blue-collar workers, their work hours have been falling, wages have been stagnating, and yet costs have been going up. I mean, college tuition has gone up 1,000% since the 1980s. When's the last time you got a 1,000% raise? Yeah, so there's a lot of strain and overwhelm in a very different way at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, where you're cobbling together a lot of different jobs just to try to make ends meet. And so I wanted to go see, innovative workplaces, not only for white-collar workers, but for blue-collar workers as well. Do only wealthy people get to have the good life or work-life balance? And that was the most exciting thing, is to find bright spots in both of those realms, so to speak. And in the workplace, I found innovative workplaces in the most unlikely places. The Pentagon, Stanford Medical School, a law firm, where they have a crazy billable hour culture, and you kind of die at your desk there, and also a high-tech firm, a software company.
That's the Menlo Innovations.
That's Menlo Innovations, and what's interesting about that is, here you've got Silicon Valley, and initially I thought, well, that's a great place to go look for innovation because, Google, and they do have the 20% time where they allow people to kind of dabble and dream, and that's where some of the most innovative stuff they've come up with. So I thought that was really going to be creative and productive. And it really took me one day of reporting to see that while there's fantastic elements about those workplaces, they've taken that long work hours almost to a crazy-making level, that in many companies, you're rewarded if you spend the night on the job. They've kind of got this hero mentality. Oh man, I worked. They've got T-shirts, 90 hours, and loving it. And what's interesting is there are places in Denmark and in other countries where they have a culture of short work hours, where if you work those long hours, you're not seen as the best worker. You're seen as inefficient, that you can't get your work done in a reasonable amount of time. And a lot of those work hours are really an element. There's really an element of poor management and unrealistic expectations. So again, that hero mentality. So at Menlo, what's interesting about that is it's a software company based in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the founder is a guy named Rich Sheridan. And when I went to talk to him, he said, this was my career in corporate America. This increasing line of more prestige, productivity, pay raises, and everything, up and up and up. And he said, and this was my happiness, this sort of flat line. And he said he got so burned out. And when you look at Harris polls and Gallup surveys, it shows that a majority of American workers are feeling burned out, disengaged, and that a vast majority would work for themselves if they could, just to get away from this feeling that you always have to be kind of on call, and if you're not at the office, then you're always available on your smartphone or your BlackBerry. And so what Rich wanted to do, he wanted to found a company based on one principle, and that was joy. And he said, and to be joyful, you do need meaningful work, hard work, sort of the classic backbone of America, but not overwork. And he wanted you to have a life. Whether you had a family or not, he wanted people to live authentic lives, which meant all parts of their life, work, love, and play. And so he organized his business to have, more like Denmark, short, intense hours that were very flexible. He came up with the idea of having paired partner work, so that no one person was indispensable. So if you decided, that if you were sick that day, or you wanted to take your kid to the zoo, or go kayaking, or just didn't feel like working that day, all you had to do was call in and say, I'm not coming in. Okay, no problem. You still had a partner, and work could go on, and you'd come in the next day. And it's part of the culture that really values that time away from the office, where you can have an open mind, you are open to new experiences. It refreshes your brain as well as your soul, so you'll come in the next day and not only be happier and refreshed, but you'll have more creativity to bring, perhaps find a new way to solve an old problem. And I think what's so refreshing about that is they're actually not only productive and innovative, but they're also profitable, and they're growing. So it really is a model that can work.
Quickly, is every worker ready for that kind of culture? Like, my sense is that a lot of people I know wouldn't know how to respond to a place that asks you to kind of put a lid on it.
Yeah, that's a great question. We live in a workaholic culture. And I think that was the other thing that's important that I discovered. It's like working in a flexible way, it's a skill. It's not like all of a sudden you're going to know how to do it. And so companies that say, okay, we're going to change, that don't go through a period of training, that don't go through a period of training not just the workers but the managers, and a period of kind of fits and starts and figuring it out. If you don't go through that, it may not work as well. But if you really, like at the Pentagon, they put in an alternative work schedule, and then they trained their managers. They told people, all right, figure out, how do you work best? Do you work best in the morning? Do you work best in the evening? Are you somebody who likes to separate work and life? Are you somebody who likes to fuse it? How do you work best? What is the mission of your job? How are you going to communicate that to figure out how much is enough? When is it good enough? How do you know? Because if you can't measure hours, you have to find metrics that you can measure. And I think that's one of the things that has really hurt previous efforts at flexibility, because they haven't really known how to measure performance. But when you do that rather than hours, you do tend to get better results.
If you weren't a reporter, you would have been a really good headline writer, because the chapter titles of your books are just so, of the book, they're so spot on. So chapter 5 is, the title of it is, "The Ideal Worker is Not Your Mother." So you've got this ideal worker, which is a really big term in her book. It's an important term, just like the overwhelm is. But we're really getting at the place that even today, the workplace, the traditional workplace, not the one you were just describing, is not very woman-friendly. It really is geared towards the male as breadwinner. Why are we still stuck there?
You know, it's such a great question, because I didn't believe that at first. I grew up in the 70s and 80s when I thought feminism was over, and everything was fair, and I had opportunities, and I think what really surprised me as I started to do this research, that the workplace really has not changed in its policies, in its culture, and also in its attitudes, really since the 1950s, the era of the organization man. And there was a study that was just a real wake-up call to me. This consulting company polled CEOs and managers of some of the biggest companies around the world and asked them, who is the ideal worker? And more than 3/4 said, the ideal worker is someone without any caregiving responsibilities. The ideal worker, more than 3/4 of the top managers and CEOs at some of the biggest companies around the world, when asked who is the ideal worker, who is the best worker, more than 3/4 said someone without any caregiving responsibilities. So that is not women, mothers, nor is it fathers who want to be more than just the distant provider. And I think that was one of the other fascinating things that I found, is that fathers who want to be more involved, fuller partners, who want to be more than just the fun dad on the weekends or the helper parent with the being delegated, but want to do more and be fully involved, and want to do more than sneak out to do the pickup every now and again, or get accolades for coaching Little League every now and again, but really want to have more day-to-day responsibilities. They are more punished at work than women are, because they're violating this kind of unconscious bias of the ideal worker. And also, men are beginning to feel more of that conflict, work-life conflict, than women are. The Pew Research Center and others have done some really fascinating work that's uncovering that sense of men are feeling stuck at work and not wanting to be.
We've talked a lot about work. Let's talk about love. This book is extremely honest about your relationship with your husband, extremely honest. In fact, I want you to read the beginning of, is it chapter 8? This is, it's called The Stalled Gender Revolution, but basically it starts with a scene at Thanksgiving, and I just want her to read it, because it's so, go for it.
Okay.
Do what you need to do, but this is a very important story, and I'm actually just going to have to sit here kind of sheepishly while she reads this, but go ahead.
Well, and the first thing I want to say is my husband and I have been married for over 20 years. And our relationship, it's a great relationship. Obviously it's deep and founded on a deep love. And yet that's not to say that it hasn't been frustrating and it hasn't had its ups and downs. But I think it's important to note that this is a story of redemption, even though it starts here in a very bad place, and that it took both of us to get here, and it's taking both of us to get out of it. But that Tom read this entire book. There's nothing here that he did not agree with. We had an agreement that I would write very honestly but that I wouldn't write anything that he did not agree with. So we had a few arguments, but I won.
Maybe I should jump in and say that Tom is Tom Bowman of NPR. So you have two people who are in double journalist, radio and print couples. My wife is a print journalist also, and I'm a radio guy. So you are a print person married to a radio guy. So, like I said, this hits home, but maybe not this part, but go ahead and read it.
Yeah, right, okay. It's 2 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. In 3 hours, 18 friends will arrive for the feast we've been hosting for years. In the previous day, while I worked full-time, I'd looked for recipes, planned the menu, put together a shopping list, and gone to the grocery store 3 times. I'd obsessed on finding a tablecloth and raced around on my lunch breaks to find one. I'd hauled folding chairs from a friend's basement late one evening. I'd baked pies with all the children who would be coming over. I'd stayed up late several nights in a row chopping vegetables and prepping for the elaborate dishes I love to cook and get around to only once a year. That morning, I'd made a quick breakfast for friends before we all dashed off to run the neighborhood turkey trot. I am still in my sweaty running clothes. The 20-pound turkey is still pink and raw, waiting to go in the oven. The table is still not set, and the kitchen, covered in pots and pans, mounds of vegetables, spilled flour, and all manner of foodstuff, looks like a bomb has gone off. Tom strolls over to the refrigerator. I think he's about to start cooking the turkey. He pulls out a 6-pack of beer. I'm going over and help Peter cook his turkey, he announces. I raise an eyebrow. My children hate that. Peter's putting his turkey in a smoker, I say. So you're going to go and sit on the patio in the sun, drink beer, and watch Peter's smoker? I ask in disbelief. Tom smiles sheepishly and walks out the door. I can't move. I actually had a knife in my hand.
But you didn't write that.
Actually, that was in the earlier draft. I called the first draft of this chapter my rage draft. This is several drafts later. All week long, I hadn't complained. I love having friends over, and I love cooking Thanksgiving dinner. I hadn't nagged for help, because after nearly 20 years of marriage, it had never done much good, and it had gotten really old. I was used to doing the holidays, which anthropologists say has always been the work of women, the holiday planning and the kin work that keep family ties strong. And Martha Stewart, that cultural icon of domestic perfection, with her intricately carved starburst pumpkin sconces that look like Tiffany lamps, and handmade corn husk dolls to set on the Thanksgiving table. Those are real. I was looking those up. Make sure we'll never feel like we've done it quite right. As I slammed the raw turkey into the oven, scurried around the kitchen to prepare dinner with, God bless her, the help of my sister Claire, who was visiting, just us women folk in the kitchen, I thought back in time. Tom and I had done pretty well dividing chores fairly when it was just the two of us. But once we had kids, the scales started tipping. And though we tried to right them every now and again, usually after I'd lost it, I always ended up feeling like I was in charge of everything. Forget having it all. It felt like I was doing it all, even though we both worked full-time and earned about the same amount of money. You are not the Lion King, I would occasionally yell, usually after finding myself scrubbing an oven hood so clogged with grease that the smoke alarms wouldn't stop screeching while he watched TV. Oof. You don't get to laze around while I do all the work. He'd shoot back that my standards were too high. You're just like Marge Simpson. When her house was burning down, she found dirty dishes in the sink and stood there washing them, he'd say. Guys will live in squalor.
Like I said, sit sheepishly by. So I don't know if I'm that bad on the Thanksgiving day. I don't know if my standards are as high as my wife's. I would not dare even say that. But it sounds like us dudes have some things to learn, especially the tipping point really is when the first baby comes home, right? That's where it starts.
That's what all of the time use research around the globe shows. So that was helpful to know that I was not alone in that. And why is because not only the ideal worker, which is a very powerful cultural norm that, you know, the guy has to work, and that's what he does, but also this other very powerful cultural norm of the ideal mother. And to get from that point, that really low point, was not just about Tom changing, but about me changing, and about both of us recognizing how those powerful cultural icons had worked on us in ways that I had not even realized. And then you get so busy that you don't even have time to think about it. You don't ever disrupt that cycle to say, why am I baking cupcakes at 2 in the morning? I want to be the good mom, and I'm worried that if I don't bring these homemade things to the Valentine's party, everybody will think I'm not the good mom. Why does Tom not feel that he has to do that to be the good dad? And why do I not realize that by staying up until 2 in the morning to be the good mom, the next day I'm so tired and cranky that I'm snapping at those very children that I'm trying to be a good mom for? So it really took both of us, kind of taking a moment to breathe. And what I started doing with Tom is really what I know how to do as a journalist. I took my reporter's notebook with me, and instead of fighting, because I would always be angry and he'd always get defensive, I just started interviewing him. We'd go on these long walks, and I'd be like, why did you never take parental leave? I was so angry with you for years. And he was finally honest, and he said where he was working at the time was another newspaper. It was not NPR. And even though that company had a policy on the books that men could take parental leave, he said nobody took it. No man took it because it was just understood that it was the kiss of death. You just didn't do that. And I think that that's what's so powerful, is that so many of our workplaces have these quote-unquote family or life-friendly policies, and you can't take them because the culture values you to be there all the time, late at night. But what's interesting is that these time studies are also showing that not only does that division of labor around the world shift when that first child comes because of these ideal worker and ideal mother cultural norms. The mom thinks that, I need to do it all. I'm wired that way. But what's interesting is that that's actually not true, that when you look at science is now emerging that shows that men have just as many physiological changes as women. Granted, there are biological differences, no doubt about it, but that men's testosterone level drops when they become fathers. They also produce the hormone prolactin, which is the hormone in women that produces breast milk. That they have these biological changes, there's neurological changes, not just in fathers, but in strangers when they look at babies, that it really shows that we as human beings, we evolved to be what they call cooperative breeders. We've always cared for the young. We've always cared for raising the next generation. But the other thing that they're finding is that when men take parental leave, solo parental leave, in, say, the Scandinavian countries where that is more accepted, frankly, because of government-funded propaganda campaigns to make it more accepted, where they would put these pictures of these gigantic Swedish wrestlers with these teeny tiny babies in their arms in all of the different health clinics. Oh, I'm taking parental leave with my son, it's great. And making it more of a cultural norm, that when fathers do that, they're finding 3 and 5 years down the road, those marriages, those partnerships have a much fairer division of labor, whereas here in the United States, women are still doing about twice the housework and twice the childcare, 2 or 3 times the childcare, even when they're working full time. So there is a real vast difference in what happens in the home sphere that we really don't talk about, that keeps men stuck at work and really prevents men from being able to lean out to be part of changing that equation, and prevents women from being able to fully lean into the workplace. And part of my book is let's reimagine those gender roles and really start shifting them. But we really can't do that until we address the workplace. And what does work mean? And how do you do excellent work in a way that doesn't kill you and suck up all of the time for the rest of your life?
So we've got the interview your spouse with a notepad, figure out what they're thinking. We've got the, yes, go on parental leave. By all means, do it. I did it. It changed my life. I would highly recommend it. But are there some day-to-day things, some processes that you and your husband have put in place that really help, that you might be able to share with us? And I'll get my notepad out.
Well, like I say, we're still a work in progress, so I'm not up here as a lifestyle guru by any means, although it might be nice. But what we decided to do, we started working with this place called the Third Path Institute, and it's really the only place that I found out there that's working on the life side of that work-life equation, and really nobody's working on play yet. That's sort of part of what I'm hoping for. We'll get a real re-embrace of the value of play and leisure. But right now, the Third Path Institute, what they do is they help, they kind of coach, they work with couples to try to help them figure out to have a fairer division of labor. And that may not be 50-50. You really have to look at what's going on in your life, what are the demands of your jobs, and how can you find a way to come up with a system that feels fair to both of you. And so, so part of that was understanding how we'd gotten to where we were. Part of that was having those long conversations. And then a big part of it was figuring out, all right, what's important to us as a family? How much work do we need to do to make sure that that happens? How do we set common standards and put in systems so that it isn't something that I have to delegate, that I'm not always the default parent? Because that's one of the things that social science is finding, is that particularly for women, you've got so much going on in your head trying to keep track of not just work, but all the home stuff, all the kids stuff, that your time becomes contaminated. You can be in a moment that would look like leisure, but you're so distracted and you're so worried and you're thinking about so much stuff that you can't fully be where you are. And now with technology, that's happening to both men and women, and we're all getting distracted and our time is fragmented. But come up with common systems, and then so you don't have to continually negotiate it, and then regularly find time to check in with each other. How is it going? We came up with the system, just for instance, in the morning, so that I would have time to read the newspaper too. That I would empty out the dishwasher and he would put it in. Now I work in my home office quite a bit. I tend to be more introverted, and that was one of the things that I learned. How do I work best? I work best when I oscillate between time out with people and reporting and having meetings and being energized by that, and then time alone with myself and my thoughts to be able to work and operationalize some of those ideas from out. So I have out days and in days. So I do work in the home office quite a bit, and there would be times that he would not do those dishes like he said he would. And I used to just rescue it. Oh, I'm just better at this anyway, I'll just do it. Without realizing that interrupts my time, that takes my time, and it takes me away from other things that are important. So what I started doing was I'd pull out my iPhone, and instead of doing the dishes, I'd take a picture of the dirty dishes, and then I'd text it to Tom with one line, "Really?" ? And then I wouldn't do the dishes. And I would sort of grit my teeth. I tend to be, I like a clean house. I sort of grit my teeth and just and not do it, and recognize that my time was more important than having those dishes done that day. And so Tom would come home from work, may not be very happy about it, but he would then do the dishes because that was the agreement we'd made. So we had to keep each other accountable. And then there were times when I would go above and beyond and start getting all resentful and pissy, and he'd be like, "This is not what we agreed to, so if you did this extra, that was your choice." And realizing, he's right, okay. I cannot be mad at you then for sitting there and relaxing, and I need to make that choice. Do I want to sit and relax, or do I want to go this extra mile when we've already come to an agreement about what's important to us, and we both agree that that's not? So it's taken both of us trying to move toward the middle.
Wow. So that's an ongoing journey for you two as a couple. You said at the beginning of this discussion and at the beginning of the book that your own journey is ongoing, but that along the way you have learned some things for you personally, effective ways to manage work and even ways of thinking about play. We're going to open this up to the audience, try to get some questions there, but I'm looking for tips on that front too, the personal front.
Okay. Well, in the book, I do talk about moving toward change on two levels. The larger structural level, looking at workplace change, cultural attitudes about our gender roles, re-embracing the value of play, and looking at our policies. And our policies are the most family unfriendly of any advanced economy. We have no paid parental leave, along with Papua New Guinea and Swaziland. So we're not in very good company there. We have no paid vacation policy, unlike any other advanced economy. If you get vacation, it's at the goodwill of your employer. You get, on average, about 2 weeks, and most of us don't take it all, and we do take work with us. So that's part of that kind of busyness and work culture. So work for change on those bigger levels, but recognize that social change takes a while. And this is your one and only life. So what are the personal mastery things that you can do right here and right now? So some of them, like I say, is learn how you work best. Take that time, pause regularly, disrupt that cycle of busyness, figure out how do you work best, what are your own priorities, be aware of these pressures to overwork, overparent, overdo, and then make those decisions about, is this important to me? Am I doing it because I think I should? How can I follow my own internal compass? find a network of supportive peers, because to try to change, push against that status quo is very difficult, if not impossible, to do on your own. You know, human beings are wired to conform, so find your own network to conform to of people who share your values. And then very briefly, just in terms of how I've organized my own day, I just used to describe my time as like time confetti, everything all at once in little bits and pieces. So what I've started to do is I've tried to chunk my time. So I do like kinds of things in specific periods. And I use timers a lot. So when it's time to work, I turn everything off and I work. When it's time to do household errands, I recognize the value of doing that. I no longer feel guilty. I do that, and I'll set a timer for 30 minutes. When it's time to check Twitter or emails, emails is still a work in progress. Boy, man, it's just the flood keeps coming in. You could spend your entire life just responding to emails. So how do I keep from being reactive so I save time to set my own agenda? So again, right now, I set a timer. I don't get through all of my inbox in a 30-minute time period. So I try to answer the most important ones in time and do kind of scheduling an email in a set period of time. And the two things that I think are most important that I want to leave with people is going back to that idea that long work hours are what makes America number one, and how we have to work these long hours to be so productive. When you look at international comparisons of GDP per hours worked, we are not the most productive per hour. We work long hours, but there are years, well, this year in particular, Norway is more productive than we are per hour. Ireland is more productive, and France, Denmark, a lot of European countries are about as productive per hour as we are. And all of those countries have 30 days of paid vacation, paid parental leave, short, intense work hours. By law, you cannot work more than 35, 37 hours in some of these countries. And France just passed a law, like Menlo Innovations does, where you cannot answer work emails or cell phone, answer work cell phones after hours. So they're doing all of those things, and they are as productive or more productive per hour than we are. So that's an important thing, is kind of getting out of your head that working long hours actually makes you more productive and effective. It doesn't. And the other thing is we're just beginning to understand that just like we have 90-minute sleep cycles at night, we have 90-minute attentiveness cycles during the day. And so when you work in these intensive bursts of, say, 90 minutes and then take a break and then another 90 minutes, you're actually more productive. And that came from really fascinating research a psychologist did at the Academy of Music in Berlin. And that was where the whole idea of 10,000 hours is what you needed to have of deliberate practice before you could become a master or excellent at anything. But inside of that, what people don't recognize is, we thought, we have to power it out in 10,000 hours, nose to the grindstone. But what this psychologist, Anders Ericsson, wanted to see is what is the difference between an excellent virtuoso musician and sort of your good but average musician. And a lot of it was how they organized their days. That the excellent musicians, they worked intensively in an intensive burst, usually early in the morning for no more than 90 minutes, and then they rested intensely. And if you look at the pattern of their day, it looks like these jagged mountain peaks. Intense periods of work, intense periods of rest. They napped more than anybody else. And then the sort of average musicians, their day kind of looked like this kind of constant pattern. They did not work intensively, nor did they rest intensively. So I think that's helped me. I actually try to work on my best days in those intensive pulses. Try to set my priorities, set the one thing that I want to do that day and do it first. Trash my to-do list. I used to live under the tyranny of it. Let's pick one thing, do that first, and then the rest of the day feels like a win rather than swimming in detritus of stuff.
I was not on deadline yesterday. Well, that's not necessarily true, but I wasn't on one of those monster deadlines that we have sometimes. And I tried some of these things. I tried the 90-minute thing. I actually got to the end of one of those 90 minutes very exhausted by all that I had done and and a little frustrated towards the end of the day that it didn't feel like I had. And I actually decided to take a 10-minute nap. I am revealing this here in front of my bosses. I'm embarrassed to say that. I'm a little sheepish, but it worked. And I walked away from the day, it didn't all get done, but a lot of it did. And I think I was actually a more present dad as a result of it when I got you know, when I got to that part of the day, which is just as important. Let's talk to people in the audience. I would be curious, and you know, we can't spend a lot of time on this, but has anyone made a big change in the way they work that really helped, that made them feel a little bit more healthy? And then, you know, obviously we'd like other questions for Bridget Schulte. Someone down here. I think Janice is going to hold that microphone for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My name is Mike Sanders. I actually wrote a book called Advanced Multitasking because I was overwhelmed. And the idea was multitasking doesn't exist. And what I did last year is I deleted 5 major things I was doing in 1 month. And I upset a lot of people because I was trying to please everybody, and I was overcommitted. And it changed my life.
Okay. Well, and
it,
we,
it
you know,
aligns with what you're saying, and I appreciate your message. Thank you.
I don't know that we've used the word multitask. Maybe once or twice here today, but you know, it's become such an obvious part of the way we see ourselves. But I mean, multitasking.
Yeah, I have one thing to say about multitasking. Don't do it. It doesn't exist.
Oh, wow.
You know, and we think that we should, and we think that we're being productive. And just like this gentleman said, it doesn't exist, that our brains cannot focus on 2 things of equal importance with the same amount of clarity and focus at the same time. Now we have brain research that shows that that's true. There's also this great myth that women are better at it by the way our brains are shaped, that we're wired for it. That's also not true. That neuroscience is showing there's more variation within gender in terms of our brain and how, you know, how function and size than there is variation across gender. There is no such thing as being wired for multitasking. It makes you as stupid as being stoned. Honest to God, they did this research study, and they found that people who were stoned actually had about the same reation time as people who are trying to multitask. So don't do it. You're not effective, and
Who would have liked to have been a part of that study?
Right. But it makes you feel more overwhelmed because it sort of adds to this sense of breathless panic. Don't do it.
Any questions? Somebody works at KPCC. Be careful. No. No.
If the organizational culture has not changed since the 1950s, we kind of pretend that it has, but it hasn't. It seems like it's not going to. I mean, think about how everything else has changed, how much everything else has changed in these decades, and this hasn't. Is it ever going to change for women? Like with the pay discrepancy, all that stuff that you talked about in Denmark. How do we get those attitudes in the United States?
Well, that's a lot of why I wrote the book, because we don't talk about it in an honest way in this country. The last time we really talked about this was back in the early 1970s, when women entered the workplace for 2 reasons: because the women's movement opened up possibilities, and because stagnant wages and rising costs forced working class women into the workplace in order to keep the same standard of living for the families. So you had this influx of women, and at the time there were Harris polls, Gallup polls that showed, wow, if we're going to have working families, if 2 parents are going to be working, we really need to support those families. Yeah, we should have high quality, affordable, accessible childcare. That's a good idea. Oh yeah, the government should help pay for that and set that up and set standards. It was sort of a non-issue. And so at the time, both houses of Congress got together and thought it was a very non-controversial bill. Let's have a high-quality universal child care system. What a great idea. And couple that with flexible work so that you would have a great place for the kids to go while you were working, but that you wouldn't be at work all the time so that you would be warehousing your kids in these child care facilities. That was sort of a no-brainer. Well, what happened was Pat Buchanan was working in the Nixon White House. I have a chapter where I went and spent the afternoon with Pat Buchanan and asked him why he did this. And what he thought was, oh my God, childcare, we're going to turn into the Soviet Union. This is communism. That the best way that Americans raise their families is if dad goes to the work and mom stays home. And he had been to the Soviet Union a few years ago and seen, or a few years before that, and seen all these young pioneers kind of marching around in lockstep, and it scared him. And if you remember, this was at the height of the Cold War, so he put a bug in Richard Nixon's ear, and Richard Nixon vetoed this bill that passed with bipartisan support, both houses of Congress, vetoed that bill, and when I went to talk to him, he said, we wanted to kill not only the bill, but the very idea of child care in the United States. And he did. And so what needs to change is to start the conversation that we stopped having in the 1970s, that the world has changed. And one of the things that's actually bringing conservatives to the table now is when you look at our birth rates. And when you look at, say, college-educated Americans, our birth rate is now 1.1. Replacement level is 2. Demographers call that baby strike level. Now, it's not that, that there are right babies and wrong babies, but when you have your educated population feels that they cannot have children and contribute to the next generation, then you've got a real crisis. You've got an unsustainable society. And that's actually bringing conservatives to the table. It's like this one that I spoke with, he said, I was opposed to the Family Medical Leave Act, which is our one family-friendly policy, and it allows for 12 weeks of unpaid medical leave, and it does not apply to 40% of the workplace. That's the only thing that we've got, and it's unpaid. And he said, I opposed that, and now that I'm a dad, I realize we've got to do something. So I think that there is sort of the beginnings of conversation. I'm hoping that my book is a game changer that will spark a lot of these conversations. And part of the reason that I talk about productivity and innovation is because that's one of the ways to get workplaces' attention. We are now in a knowledge economy. We are only as good as our next idea. And if we want those ideas, you have to have breaks. You have to be idle, that in idleness, your brain is actually more active. So that I'm hoping these ideas will actually catch on and help make life better for everybody.
Please.
Hi, my name is Rita. So I think going along the same lines as the gender imbalances, I think nowadays, in America, there's a small segment perhaps that where the women actually make more than the men. And the men, they become like the caretakers and the soccer dads. What unique set of, it's a whole completely different set of challenges. Can you talk a little bit about what those may be? Because I don't think we've mentioned those.
Right, yeah, I have a whole chapter called New Dads in the book. Particularly in the Great Recession, when so many men lost jobs, they did sort of by default, many of them became the primary caregivers, and the wives or the partners went into the workplace. So there is this growing movement of stay-at-home dads, but you have to remember it's still only 1% of all dads. It's a very, very small percentage. What you do have are dads who are trying to do both. You have more dads who are actually trying to be more active, and that's where they're beginning to feel that pressure because they tend to be more stuck at work with the ideal worker notions. And there was a study that I cite in the book that took dads with traditional attitudes, I'm the breadwinner, I'm supposed to bring home the bacon, and dads with progressive attitudes, that they wanted to be fuller partners. And they found that they both worked the same amount of hours at work, but that the progressive-minded dads were doing what women did 30 years ago, which was give up personal care, leisure, and sleep in order to spend more time with their children, and beginning to feel very harried and stressed out. And while I feel sorry for those dads, I'm sad that that's happening. To your point, I think that the more people realize this is not a mommy issue, this has never been a mommy issue, this is a family issue, this is a life issue, this is a human rights issue, a sustainability issue, the more that we can have a conversation that includes everybody about how we work and live and how we can recapture play, I think that the more we get people in that conversation, the more we're likely to have change.
I think we have time for one more question, though you're really good at tying things up, and it's like a nice end, but please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Brian.
Nice
I'm
name.
wondering what you may have found about my generation, the generation that's kind of young in the workforce. It seems like in quiet moments with my peers, we all seem to dream about just leaving the stress behind. Is this ubiquitous with my generation, and is it a problem, or how do you feel about that?
If you're talking about millennials, I say go millennials. I think that millennials can really help lead the way out for a lot of us. There's a lot of, they're slackers, they don't work as hard, on and on. These are the precious coddled generation, that we doted on. But you know what? There are plenty of polls that show that both men and women of the millennial age, they want to do meaningful work, but they don't want to overwork. They're ambitious. They also, both men and women, really value time for family. They want to have both. But at the same time, you've got so many millennials saying they're not going to have families because they don't see how they can combine them both in a realistic way. Stu Friedman at the Wharton School has just put out a book called Baby Bust, where he's looked at millennials in this generation and then compared them to people their age 20 years ago. And only about half as many say that they plan to have families. So we're back in this era where we think it's an either-or choice. Either I'm going to work or I'm going to stay home and have families. And I think that's a terrible place to be. So I'm hoping that millennials who are creative and entrepreneurial, and they're walking with their feet, and companies are starting to listen, that if they want to attract the best talent, it's really a race for talent in a knowledge economy, that they have to change their sort of recalcitrant and rigid and old style of thinking, that they're going to have to disrupt their own cycles of busyness and take a look at their own internal cultures. So, for millennials, I just say, keep dreaming, because I think you can help us all lead the way out.
Well, thanks very much, Bridget Schulte, for joining us today. This has been an absolutely extraordinary discussion. This book was a very, very important book for me to be reading at this point in my life, so I want to give you a personal thanks, a KPCC thanks, a Drucker Business Forum thanks, and thanks to the audience that joined us here at the Crawford Family Forum.
Thank you.